I'm not a big fan of the BMW GS lineup. Maybe I'm biased, but let's take the picture of the last couple of years, just its objective parameters. The 1250 GS is the heaviest motorcycle in the class. It has the weakest engine with the strongest vibrations, equipped with the weakest brakes and the worst quickshifter among the competition. It doesn't have any cutting-edge technologies that others have while having a high price tag. And I also have a bunch of subjective complaints about the older GS. Pretty obvious ones when you live in the same world with the Multistrada V4, the KTM 1290, and the Tiger 1200. Has the 1300 GS gotten better? Yes, you've already read the title. Today we are going to talk about what BMW did to make me suddenly change my opinion and recommend this model for purchase. I had complaints about the engines of previous versions. The new 1300cc engine has a whole bunch of significant changes. It's important to realize that the engine has been simplified by reconfiguring and throwing away unnecessary parts. When you read about the changes they made, try to answer the question, what prevented them from implementing these changes 10 or 15 years ago? The old motor had poor technical solutions originating from the middle of the previous century. Like having a legacy programming code when each new developer adds something new while leaving old rudimentary pieces, so after a while, no one remembers what each piece does and why it's still there. The motor was rebuilt from scratch. There are no fancy solutions in it. It took BMW 100 years to complete their boxer engine. My main complaint to the BMW was about strong vibrations coming not on high revs, but when it's working in its operation range. Journalists didn't say a word about it, but if you read their new reviews, the same people mentioned that the 1250 GS had problems with vibrations. No way! You'll live and learn. Now don't get me wrong, I can live with vibrations. For example, riding dirt bikes or lightweight jack of all trade adventure motorcycles, or cheap beginner bikes, you know? I can understand why I should tolerate it, but when we're talking about the GS, which is more pavement than dirt oriented touring motorcycle, that costs a lot of money. In my opinion, we should have a basic requirement of having increased comfort. And it does its main job very poorly. When you are riding it at legal freeway speeds on the 6th gear, you have it constantly hitting your hands, and the question is why you should tolerate it knowing its competitors don't do that. So, with the 1300 GS, you can forget about the vibrations. First, you can ride the same speeds having lower revs thanks to increased power, even if the speed is decent. There are no vibrations. Yes, there is some shaking at idle, but when it's moving, it's a completely normal bike. You don't think about any vibrations. Vibrations are not significant, neither in your hands nor your legs, even with removed foot peg rubber bands. So it's not only about the modified handlebar mount. You might feel some if you push the tank with your knees, but that's not an issue. You can always get rubber pads anyways. Comparing it to the competition, the engine is not as smooth as the Multistrada's V4, but also having a night and day difference with the KTM 1290, which has now remained as the only bike in its class having obvious vibration problems. Secondly, if we're talking about the 1250 GS ignoring some older generations, we can't say the motorcycle has a stable low rev performance. It tends to stall at low revs, which doesn't happen with the 1300. You can leave the clutch at about 1500 RPM and enjoy its smoothness. Tiger could do that, and now the GS can too. It's not to say that it was a huge problem, but when your engine is smooth and stable at low revs, it's much more comfortable to crawl in traffic thanks to its elasticity. Or balancing the lowest possible revs while riding through wet mud so you don't have to downshift, etc., stuff like that. And now it's not just possible, but it has become as good as the best motorcycles are. Also, it got a bit more power while becoming lighter. Meanwhile, still being the weakest adventure motorcycle above 1100cc until the Chinese Motor Morini arrives. but that boost in power to weight ratio is noticeable. I wouldn't say the 1250 lacks power or something, but sometimes its response feels like it could be snappier, unlike the 1300. By the way, while the 1300 has bigger displacement, the stroke was even reduced, having increased only the bore. The bike is now similar to the KTM in terms of cylinder geometry. While it certainly could lose a drag race with cranked out revs to the Multistrada or 1290, and the RG 1300 GS will never match the fear and the insanity you feel with the S1000XR and the Multistrada V4, especially the Pikes Peak version. If you're used to the Power 4s, you might not like the new Boxer. On the flip side, the Multistrada or the XR don't have that bottom grunt as the GS, so it's kind of a trade-off. The 4s give you stable and synthetic acceleration, while the 1300 GS likes short bursts. The Quickshifter works so much better now. On the 1250 GS, it did not stand up to any criticism. I mean, if you were riding only BMW motorcycles on a deserted island for all your life, it might not feel that bad, but it was simply incomparable to Quickshifters on the Multistrada V4 or the Tiger 1200. The new one is still not perfect, and it doesn't match its competitors, but at least it's just not bad. I also don't have any complaints about the gearbox and the clutch. Summarizing, the engine is good, so I cannot wait to see the new RT. It's a great motorcycle, having its motor as the biggest flaw. I'm not a big fan of BMW's telelever or paralevel suspension, to say the least. I mean, it's a great pavement suspension, but on dirt, any adventure motorcycle with the same wheel travels performs better. And if you're not going to dirt, why would you need this long travel at all? There are plenty of versatile and overall excellent around 170mm suspensions on the market. And BMW themselves call the GS a touring enduro on their website. I also had a complaint about the GS's swing arm durability. BMW at one time abandoned clamps, having made a rubber boot being held into the grooves. There was a significant risk that the rubber boot might not hold tightly enough, and the moisture, having no ways to escape, will go right into the swing arm, hence rusting. Since the end of 2021, they've implemented an additional valve at the bottom of the swing arm. And in 2022, there was a huge recall campaign to replace with rusty shafts and massing drilling holes in the swing arm of all the R1200 LC and R1250 motorcycles. So they've completely fixed this issue on the new GS, but they did it by making the drive shaft disposable and just adding a new line to the maintenance schedule. The new GS needs the drive shaft replaced every 80,000 kilometers. Just to compare, the typical drive shaft from Japanese brands requires only its oil to be changed once in 3 years. Yeah, anyway, let's talk about the suspension. The older GS's suspension worked with no complaints when it was on pavement, though I find its longer version on the rally and adventure models more on the plush side. But the semi-active basic length suspension combined with the short wheelbase and ultra-short trail made the GS the sharpest canyon chaser in the class. It was pure joy. By the way, the 1300 has a longer trail because of the wheel. It has been moved forward, so now the trail is mediocre. I think it makes it more stable on accelerations, considering the bike has a stronger engine. Nevertheless, the bike is still crazy in canyons and when maneuvering at low speeds. I have absolutely no complaints about the handling. The suspension was also made better, and it's not only about the new hardware, it's the software too. For example, previously they only had a few suspension dampening options for each driving mode. Now, each suspension setting can be adjusted to be a little softer or a little harder. Of course, almost all the time I rode it at the hardest +2 mode. It feels like the softest mode on sports touring motorcycles. To be honest, in this setting, the suspension is still stiff enough, but it still handles common roads and bumps. So I had no desire to switch it, but you can always soften it if you want to. I tried, so it danced up and down, but there are no roads broken that hard in Spain. So I'm not sure where I could enjoy it, but maybe other people would like it. So I like the suspension in general if you ride pavement. So does it have any flaws? Yeah, I don't like it when I rode on dirt. When there are smoother waves, it handles fine, but once you hit a bigger rock on a square bump, then it hits you hard. You know what I mean, one of those holes where your phone mount turns around the handlebar. Here, I'm riding a trophy version with spoked wheels, and you can just jump off these stairs, which is more effective and, of course, more fun. But when you jump off even a 30 centimeter down, the GS makes it clear that it has a special suspension and a heavy final drive, so I had to avoid any jumps and carefully roll over bumps. As well as when you hit a little 7 centimeter rock at a decent speed. It's hard to explain it on video, but I might come here again with a heavier bike and a conventional suspension, which is also chain driven, so I can demonstrate it on video how much better it should handle the same terrain. A good example is the new Africa Twin Adventure Sport, which is heavier, having the same wheel size, same ground clearance, and similar suspension travels. My experience tells me it's going to feel much more refined and smooth here. Riding the GS here feels like having wheels on a grand piano that was just pushed down the stairs. And, okay, fine, I agree. The analogy is a bit too strained here. Grand pianos ride smoother. My initial thought was the suspension was left in dynamic mode, but it wasn't, because when you change the riding mode to Enduro, the suspension mode is changed as well, so the settings were fine. Also, I rode the bike in Enduro mode, and it's the tallest preload setting to experiment with different dampening settings. It also was not about the weight, because the KTM 1290 SAS weighs about the same, but it jumps just right. So the GS just doesn't compete with the 1290 or the Africa Twin on dirt. Does not have fun. But then again, the vast majority of GS buyers don't need that though. I just don't want you to believe that those puffing up the reviews just saying the GS is almost the Tenere killer. It just isn't. Can you ride on some trails at 10, 20 kilometers an hour? Sure, no problem. Should you take these trails for the entire weekend? No, you shouldn't. And what's more important, considering how much it costs, you can get a dual sport as a change if you sacrifice by buying a couple extras for the GS, so you get incomparably more fun. The ergonomics on this, I just don't get any complaints. It seems to have a narrower profile than the 1250 GS, so when you're riding upstand, it feels right. You feel it's a 1300cc motorcycle, but not a skinny dual sport, but it's still better than the 1250. And I also don't have any complaints for its off-road handling. It is very agile, and the only downside is its special suspension. There is a sportier suspension available, which is about 10% longer, but remembering my experience with the 1250 generation, where the lingered suspension was used on the rally and adventure versions, I don't recommend buying that. Because the longer suspension on the 1250 noticeably worsened handling on twisties, while it didn't change the game off-road. Yes, it is a little softer, but the issue isn't that it was too short. The problem is that it's still a telelever design. For example, the Tenere has almost the same wheel travels, having dirt cheap suspension, but it's night and day difference how it handles bumps off-road compared to the GS. By the way, it's a good thing that BMW didn't put the longer suspension to the off-road trophy version and combined the default one with spoked wheels. In my opinion, this is the better combo. Paying this price for a motorcycle to ride it off-road is very controversial. While the stock suspension is enough for taking occasional trails, plus having spoked wheels lowers the risk of bending the rims while hitting bumps, so here BMW did it right. You can get the Multistrada with spokes too, but it's too shiny to make people want to take the risks of scratching it while riding off-road. The Tiger 1200 GT unlike its previous generation, doesn't have spoked wheels available, even as a paid extra, while I cannot describe a person who might need to take the rally version. The KTM doesn't reach the level of comfort of the GS, so it turns out, if you want to own a high-end, very powerful adventure motorcycle capable of chasing canyons while having spokes just in case, the GS doesn't really have any competition. Everything here comes with its trade-offs. Another drawback of the 1250 GS was its seat height, and many people bought the adventure version, which height was inadequate and close to pure off-road machines. I couldn't understand why people chose suffering when there were plenty of decent crossovers around which were significantly lower. I know there are tricks to shorten it with seat and suspension, but first, the stock suspension on the GS was already not everyone's cup of tea, and the seat had a mediocre comfort level, so when you lower it, you just made things worse. Secondly, the competitors also had lowering options. I mean, on paper, the 1300 GS has the same numbers, but first, for me, it felt like it became narrower up front, so it's easier for you to reach the ground. Second, it has adaptive height control. BMW did not invent this feature, it was brought to us by Pan America, but it wasn't as refined, because the motorcycle went down only after stopping. Then the Multistrada got the same feature, but of course they did it their way. That's a long story. In general, when talking about the 1300 GS, it's hard not to think about the Multistrada, because Simpsons already did it. I remind you that the Multistrada V4 was already released in 2021, and it had a whole bunch of technologies that were not praised by reviewers on the GS. Actually, the reason why the Ducati had been the best full-size adventure motorcycle for 3 years was because BMW dawdled being selling the same motorcycle they had been for more than 10 years straight. Anyways, back to the height control. The GS can lower itself by 3 centimeters. The feature will be engaged automatically for chosen riding modes. It's going to lower the height in advance at speeds below 25 kilometers an hour and raise it back up when you accelerate enough. I'm describing these details so you understand the seat height is actually 820 millimeters when the bike is standing. The ground clearance on the new generation has been slightly increased. It measured 220 millimeters, the same as on the previous GS Adventure. So even if you set it to the lowest settings, you're gonna get 190 millimeters. It's enough to ride over typical bumps. But if you get over rocks fast pushing the suspension to its limits, the bike is going to knock the bottom sooner than you expect. Now what I liked is when you selected, for example, the Enduro mode. You can set maximum and minimum height so the bottom of the motorcycle doesn't touch the ground. You press the button and the bike becomes taller. The opposite is also true. You can make the bike stay lowered for the entire time being in a selected mode. It makes the GS a good choice for short-legged people now. You don't have to struggle with it as much as you did with the older 1200 and 1250. And let's not forget that the motorcycle, from being the heaviest in its class, became the lightest one, at least on paper. There is a catch though, when it stops being the lightest after you add on all of the extras its competitors get from the factory. But it's hard to deny that the new GS generation is lighter than the previous one. It still doesn't feel as nimble as mid-size motorcycles, maybe only if you compare it to its rivals from China, but considering its height adjust feature and seat shape, it doesn't feel as heavy as its predecessors. That's simply a fact. The 1300 also got an electric windshield adjustment. Moreover, when you turn off the ignition, it moves the shield down. It doesn't make much sense, but it looks kind of flashy. So you might want to rev it up a couple times before turning it off so everyone notices that you have a shiny new toy. Jokes aside, BMW finally put a decent stock windshield. I would say the new 1300 GS has a better stock windscreen than many aftermarket options for the 1250, It's going to be flawless for most people. It conventionally doesn't cover very tall riders completely if they want to ride it with an open visor and no goggles. So they might tolerate it even though they might feel some wind, but you just don't get any direct wind flow to your eyes. I didn't feel any wind buffeting, and the bike was still stable going around 200 kilometers an hour, so I only used the tallest windshield position. There was no reason for me to make it lower. You can adjust distance to the vehicle up front on the active cruise control. The distance also depends on your speed, so remember I'm telling it in seconds rather than meters. The closest distance on the GS is around the middle position on the Multistrada. It's handy, for example, in city mode on a Ducati, so you can stay as close as possible and no one desires to cut you off thinking this traffic was caused by just the goddamn motorcyclist, and then increase the safe distance when the traffic goes on the highway, you know? Because the GS keeps too far behind, other distance options might be useful only when it's raining. Even with the closest distance options when riding beltways, others will often merge into your gap. I also noticed that when you're riding in the left lane, people don't give you the right of way until you decrease the distance with your throttle. The radar is very useful in two cases. First, when you're riding in a city beltway when people usually don't filter through traffic and it's also uniform. The traffic might have accordions, but the radar helps. Second, the best case scenario is the typical heavy traffic on a mountain road with a single solid line and the speed keeps waving up and down. Active cruise control noticeably reduces the level of stress and concentration caused by the traffic. The motorcycle rides it by itself. Also, I think flagship motorcycle owners also have cars with this feature. It's convenient when the vehicles have similar behavior. For many, active cruise control is a really useful feature to try out. I'm also reminding you that it's available on the KTM 1290 in its cheapest version and on the Multistrada V4 from 2021, just so you don't forget whose generation was behind the competition. Blind spot monitoring is also not the cutting edge tech, and to be honest, the BMW has the worst implementation of it I have ever seen. I mean, it works as the competition, but the triangle itself is so tiny you just don't see it at sunset or when there's a yellow headlight behind you. You have to look directly into the mirror to see it, but you can't always notice it with your side vision. On the Multistrada or the Tiger, these indicators are located on the side of the mirrors. So no matter what's in the mirror, you notice the contrast and the color change, as well as the indicators themselves are getting bigger. Not to mention the Multistrada, or especially the Tiger, have excellent rear view mirror visibility, while they were and still are bad on the BMW. I rarely talk about mirrors because it's a cheap upgrade part, but here we have mirrors that are LED. I think sooner or later aftermarket options should become available. And of course, they made dropping the bike more expensive. To make it pricier, they put signals on the handguards even on the trophy version. In fact, if you buy the Extra Protection Enduro package, you'll get conventional turning lights and simple handguards. And by the way, speaking of the famous BMW packages, all my enthusiasm from above should be taken with a grain of salt, considering the new GS, having all the necessary features, will cost you around 28,000 to 29,000 euros. And that's before the classes, the comfort seat, the carbon, exclusive paints, and so on and so forth. The claimed 21,000 euros is a bare bones bike with a simple cruise control. Just to compare, a stock KTM 1290 SAS is 1,500 euros more expensive while having the radar, semi-active suspension, and a center stand. Remembering the 1250 generation, the basic non-electric suspension is not worth considering because it's much worse than the electric one. Comparing similar buffed up packages, the KTM is 5,000 to 6,000 euros cheaper, and this is how much a new dual sport motorcycle costs. The Tiger 1200 GT Pro is about 4,000 to 5,000 euros cheaper. The Ducati, with all its extras, is around 2,000 euros more expensive. In general, you need to understand that the GS, as the version I'm showing you now, is the most expensive adventure motorcycle on the market. And you might also remember that for 16,000 euros, you might get a buffed up Tiger 900 GT Pro, which has a similar level of comfort and ergonomics as the GS. The pattern in many people's minds is that the 1200s automatically become more comfortable, but it's simply not the case. If we compare foot peg, seat, handlebar, points, triangle, the Tiger 900 has more or less the same distance, as well as a similar wind protection. The Triumph has an insignificantly narrow windshield, while the BMW has a noticeable issue when a wind flow from the top of the cylinders hits your knees, causing your knees to become numb with some knee protection, which doesn't happen on the Triumph. It's a fact, because of a specific aerodynamic knee pad that are being pushed into your knees, so they get tired after a long ride on the highway, unlike riding other top-end competitors. Most likely it won't be an issue with the GS Adventure though, or you might have to try different knee pads to solve the issue. The seat comfort is average among other premium adventure motorcycles. It's comfy, but it's still far behind stock seats on the Tigers. I mean, you can expect the GS to be a comfortable motorcycle, but it's by far not the most comfortable motorcycle. And it still doesn't reach the comfort level of the Multistrada or maybe a 100-year-old Super Tenere. But the 1300 GS is much closer than the 1250 was, making that difference not critical anymore. Let's also discuss other shortcomings of the new GS. The older 1250 GS already had its tank size on the smaller side considering the engine displacement, and now the consumption went up a little while the tank size shrinked 1 liter more. So it's the smallest tank among adventure motorcycles with over 1100cc displacement. All for the sake of the phone drawer. It's for once a normal size for a large phone, but it's not usable when the handlebar is locked, but still reachable to steal the phone. Well done! What can I say? The small range used to be solved in the Adventure version, which is not available yet. The consumption rate is average for the class, but I personally get tired of going to the gas station every 200 kilometers. So I am waiting for the Adventure version. It's still the most adequate GS version for touring though. It's a funny fact that in the previous generation, when the Multistrada Enduro was discontinued, the BMW was the king of the big tanks and the pride of the BMW fans. But now Ducati have their 30-liter version, Triumph has 2, while BMW released a tester sample. All of the BMW fans will learn to change their cams to, it's not about size, it's how you use it.
Fuel tank capacity is 19 liters.
Okay.
So it's good for more than 300 kilometers riding.
Wow. That's a good long way.
Another major con is their interfaces. The multi-wheel and the dash screen logic is still just a logistical nightmare since it has been launched. The biggest nonsense is just this multi-wheel itself, which just doesn't make much sense being useful only when you either use the BMW Navigator or the BMW Navigation smartphone app. But you'd have to be a pretty weird person to choose it for being anything in 2024. And because of the multi-wheel, the turn switch is being moved farther from the grip than other motorcycles, making using the clutch disengaged very awkward. Interesting fact that all the competitors have changed the generation of their screen interfaces in the last 3 years, fixing earlier versions, while BMW still has the same controversial interface as it was when it was released, unchanged. The 1300 GS got many new features, so they had to somehow place all of them on the same interface. It's inconvenient and cumbersome. You don't often have to push different buttons on the left switch, which is moved away from under your thumb because of the multi-wheel, yet it is the only flagship adventure motorcycle who didn't get backlit buttons. BMW interfaces follow the philosophy that everything is preset with minimal customization options. I prefer the Ducati way, where you can set a huge amount of parameters to your liking in any mode. The main screen of the BMW is just poor. For example, you cannot see the range and the consumption, or any other 2 parameters, only 1 parameter at a time. The screen doesn't show you chosen settings, for example, which suspension settings are set, which traction control setting is on. There is plenty of space for it on other motorcycles in the class. I know it's not a deal breaker, but I had to mention this. So, yeah, here are my final thoughts. I like the new GS, but I don't idealize it. There are a range of jobs for it, and it does them well, but it's not almighty. There are more myths about the GS than there are hard truths. On one hand, it's not an ideal dirt travel motorcycle, even compared to other big adventure motorcycles like the 1290 or Africa Twin, not to mention the less heavy bikes. On the other hand, it's not for those who feel the need for speed. It's fast enough, but it doesn't give you the feel of a 4-cylinder sport tourer. The GS has always been something in between, but it lacked comfort. The new version is almost always a little more balanced than the 1290 and the Multistrada. Things are a bit more complicated when comparing them to the Tiger 1200, which is worth a separate talk. And most importantly, when I met a brand new 1250 on the road, I had a slight pity, because this guy might get a better motorcycle for that price. Now when I see the 1300 GS, I will be happy for the owner because he rides a good and well-balanced motorcycle.